In 1938, 52-year-old Professor Chi Pu-Te climbed the Bayan Karula mountains with a dozen students and returned with a discovery that world science chose to ignore. More than 70 years later, not one of the 716 stone discs discovered in those caves is listed in any museum catalog in the world. They simply disappeared. Chi Pu-Te taught archaeology at Peking University. Colleagues described him as a methodical man, devoid of any tendency toward mystification. He wore the same gray jacket in spring and fall, rode his bicycle across campus, and kept field notes in a small, almost calligraphic handwriting. Nothing in his biography foreshadowed what would happen in the high-altitude caves on the border of China and Tibet. The expedition left Xining in early April. The journey into the mountains took almost 3 weeks. The Bayan Karula ridge greeted them with low clouds and a piercing wind, normal weather for these places at an altitude of about 4,000 meters above sea level. The group explored a cave system that locals spoke of reluctantly and had never visited themselves. On May 1st, according to Chi Pu-Te's notes, the students discovered the first chamber. What they saw didn't fit into any known cultural tradition of the region. Along the walls were regular rows of shallow graves. Each contained a skeleton about 120 centimeters tall, with a disproportionately large skull and thin, almost fragile limb bones. There were no funerary objects or jewelry. Next to each burial is a stone disc, about 30 centimeters in diameter, with a hole in the center. A total of 716 of these were counted. The discs were carved from a material that Chi Pu-Te initially mistook for ordinary granite. However, each one has a spiral groove running from the center to the edge. When one of the students held a magnifying glass to the surface, he discovered that the groove wasn't empty. It was engraved with symbols. Tiny ones, less than a millimeter wide. Thousands of symbols on each disc. Chi Pu-Te wrote only one sentence in his diary. "This cannot be done by hand." The discs were delivered to Beijing. The Academy of Prehistoric Research took on the task of deciphering them. 20 years of work. 20 years of silence. In 1962, Professor Tsum Nui announced the results. According to him, the signs represented a script that was not similar to any known system, but could be partially translated through comparative analysis with archaic forms of Chinese and Tibetan writing. The contents were as follows. A certain race, calling itself Dropa, crashed in these mountains approximately 12,000 years ago. The crew survived, but the ship was beyond repair. The local tribes initially greeted the newcomers with hostility. "People with yellow leathery faces killed us at dawn," read one fragment of the translation. Over time, some of the crew blended in with the local population. No. The Academy forbade Tsum Nui from publishing his results. The official wording, "The conclusions do not correspond to the historical method." The professor emigrated to Japan, where he died soon after. His archive was not preserved. The discs, meanwhile, were distributed among several institutions. The bulk, according to available information, was transferred for safekeeping to the collections of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. None of the journalists and researchers who requested access were granted it. Official inquiries were met with the same response. These items are not listed in the collection registry. In 1974, the Austrian engineer and antiquities enthusiast Ernst Wegerer found himself in Xi'an on business. At the local history museum, in one of the halls with exhibits without detailed labels, he saw 2 discs. They were lying on an ordinary wooden shelf, slightly dusty. Wegerer asked permission to photograph them. Permission was granted without objection. The spiral groove and central opening are clearly visible in the photographs. When another researcher tried to find these discs in the same museum several years later, the staff replied that they did not know what they were talking about. Wegerer's photographs are the only visual evidence of the existence of the discs that has survived to this day. In the 70s, Soviet researcher Vyacheslav Zaitsev obtained permission to study several discs that were allegedly stored in a closed collection at one of the Beijing institutes. According to his data, analysis of the material showed traces of cobalt and other metals in the composition of the stone, as if the discs were exposed to high temperatures or radiation. When the discs were placed on a special stand and connected to a power source, They, according to Zaitsev, began to vibrate at a certain frequency, as if an electric charge were passing through them. This data has not been verified by independent researchers. Zaitsev cited documents that were subsequently lost. Two small ethnic groups, the Kam and the Dropa, still live in the Bayan Karula region today. Anthropologists have long noted their unusual physical type. The height of adult males rarely exceeds 150 centimeters, and the volume of the cranium is somewhat larger than the average for East Asia. Genetic studies of these groups are classified or have not been conducted, depending on who you ask. Local elders respond to questions about the caves and discs with silence. 716 discs. Not a single one in the public domain. Not a single one in the catalog. Just photographs of an Austrian engineer, taken in the hall without labels, and a translation that the Academy ordered destroyed. We don't know what was engraved on the remaining 714 discs. We don't know what happened to the Tsum Nuya translation. We don't know who decided to remove the discs from the museum in Xi'an, or when. But someone made this decision. Why do you think? In 1923, a British museum employee, while sorting through boxes of Iraqi artifacts, dropped one of the figurines onto the stone floor. It didn't break. He picked it up, held it up to the light, and, according to his colleague Leonard Woolley, couldn't utter a word for several minutes. He simply looked at it. What exactly he saw in the eyes of this clay creature remained unsaid. These were not the first such figurines found in the Middle East, but it was they, brought from the Tel al-Ubaid hill in southern Iraq, who turned out to be so perfect in their inhuman precision that they became the subject of controversy that continues to this day. It all began 4 years earlier. In 1919, British archaeologist Harry Reginald Hall, a veteran of several expeditions to Egypt and Mesopotamia, arrived in the province of Dekar. He was 42 years old, with the First World War behind him, a position in the Department of Egyptian and Assyrian Antiquities at the British Museum, and a reputation for being methodical and not given to fantasies. Hall drove an old Model T Ford, which regularly got stuck in the dust between Basra and Nasiriyah. In his field diary, he recorded temperatures, distances, and porterage costs. Nothing extraneous. Tel al-Ubaid is a low hill, about 2 meters above the plain, just 6 kilometers from Ur. Local residents didn't attach much importance to it. It's just a hill. Hall began probing in March, when the heat was still bearable. The first layers yielded pottery from the Ubaid culture, the one that predated the Sumerian civilization by approximately 2 millennia, 5,000 years BC, 6,000 years BC. The deeper, the older. And then the figurines began. They were unearthed by the dozens. Clay, fired, 10 to 20 centimeters high. At first glance, they looked like ordinary idols, the kind found throughout the region. But upon closer inspection, something didn't add up. The heads were too elongated, not a deformation, not an accident, a deliberate, consistent form. Almond-shaped eyes with horizontal slits, which no other human race has. The skin on most of the figurines wasn't smooth. It was textured, with stripes reminiscent of scales. Many of their skulls were covered with tight-fitting helmets or headdresses, indistinguishable from the head itself. They hold staffs, symbols of power. But the most disturbing discovery was made later, during the systematic excavations of Woolley's expedition. A figurine of a female. She was breastfeeding a baby. Both the female and the infant, both with the same elongated reptilian features, the same scaly bodies, the same inhuman eyes. This was not an image of a demon devouring a child. It was a feeding scene, tender, ordinary. That's precisely what made it unbearable to watch. Official science quickly developed its own version and hasn't changed since. Professor Joan Oates of Cambridge and her colleagues interpreted the figurines as depictions of gods or priests wearing ritual masks, possibly associated with a fertility cult or chthonic forces. The mask theory seemed convincing, almost convincing, because masks don't give that kind of face. A mask is an overlay. It sits on top of a human head, suggesting human anatomy underneath. Ubaid figurines do not have a human head beneath the reptilian one. An elongated skull is just that, a skull. Scaly skin is skin, not a suit. And no mask in human history has ever been worn on a newborn held at its mother's breast. It is necessary to say here that it is this region, southern Mesopotamia, that is the cradle of the Sumerian civilization. It was here, a millennium and a half after the Ubaid culture, that the world's first written texts appeared. And among these texts are detailed descriptions of the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens, creatures that interbred with humans, creatures that founded the first cities and gave people laws. Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki inconsistently, somewhere as gods, somewhere as foreign rulers, somewhere as something fundamentally different. But several details are repeated with a steady consistency. They were covered with something like scales or shining garments. Their eyes are described as inhuman. They possessed symbols of power, those same staffs. And they came not from some mythical place, but specifically from this land, from these swamps, from this sky above the Tigris and Euphrates. The Ubaid figurines predate the Sumerians by 2,000 years. They are older than the first written language. They are older than the first cities. But they depict, or attempt to depict, the same creatures the Sumerians would later write about, as if their memory had never been interrupted, as if they had been seen, not just once, not in one generation, but over the course of millennia, again and again, molding the same inhuman features from river clay. Today, some of the Ubaid figurines are kept in the Iraqi National Museum in Baghdad. Another part is in the Museum of Natural History in New York. They are displayed without much fanfare, in display cases among other ceramics of the era. A plaque reads, "Ritual Images, Ubaid Culture, 5th Millennium BC." They are not wearing any masks. In 2003, during the American invasion of Iraq, the Iraqi museum was looted. More than 100,000 artifacts disappeared. Most of them have never been found. Among the missing items were several Ubaid figurines, catalogued back in the 1940s. Iraqi authorities attributed this to looting. Possibly. But it is strange that the looters, amidst the chaos of war, deliberately removed small clay figurines from one specific room, leaving the gold jewelry in the adjacent display cases untouched. It could be a coincidence. A lot of things could be coincidences. But here's a question that haunts me. If the Ubaid masters sculpted masked gods 6,000 years ago, why did they sculpt them breastfeeding children? Who did they see? What did they remember? And why does this memory so closely match what people would record on clay tablets in cuneiform 2 millennia later? What exactly happened in these swamps before writing emerged? In 1980, Chinese archaeologist Wang Binghua recovered a woman's hand from the sands of the Taklamakan Desert. The hand belonged to a corpse that had lain in the ground for nearly 4,000 years. But her skin was fair, and her hair was reddish-brown. This was 2,000 years before the first European, who, according to all history books, even reached these parts. The Taklamakan Desert is located in the very heart of Central Asia, where any logical route ends, and what the Chinese have historically called the place of no return begins. Several million square kilometers of scorching sand, surrounded on 3 sides by mountain ranges. It's 40 degrees above zero in summer, 20 below zero in winter. There's no water, no life. It would seem there was no history. But there was history, and it didn't fit into any of the accepted concepts. The first finds appeared at the end of the 19th century, during British and Swedish expeditions along the ruins of the Silk Road. At that time, almost no attention was paid to them. Scattered bones, scraps of fabric, fragments of wood. The real discovery came later, when Chinese and Uyghur researchers began systematic excavations along the dry riverbeds of the Lulan and Churchin rivers. What they extracted from the sand defied any academic paradigm. There were hundreds of mummies, naturally preserved, without embalming, without any special preparation of the body. The dry climate and saline soil preserved them so precisely that some faces still had eyelashes, lips, and expression lines. And all of them, most of them, had non-mongoloid features. Tall, long, narrow noses, deep-set eyes, light, almost white skin, and hair, red, chestnut, dark blonde, colors that simply should not have been in Central Asia 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, according to everything that official science knew. The most famous of them was called the Beauty of Lulan. She died around the 18th century BC. Her height was about 180 centimeters. The facial features are so regular and so atypical for the region that the first researchers remained silent for several minutes over the excavation, not daring to record the data in the field journal. Next to her lay a comb, a basket, a grain of wheat, and a small knife in a leather sheath. Everything was preserved. But what happened next was perhaps no less strange than the finds themselves. The Chinese government has closed access to the mummies. Officially, this is due to their fragility and the need for proper preservation. Several foreign researchers who requested permission for genetic analysis were denied without explanation. Photographs taken during the initial excavations were not published for a long time. Some of the materials ended up in the closed collections of the Urumqi Museum, a city located in Xinjiang, the very region where political tensions surrounding the Uyghur issue continue to rage to this day. The connection is obvious, although no one officially acknowledges it. Xinjiang is not just a geographical name. This is a territory that China considers to be its own, but which a significant part of the population, the Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking Muslim people, perceives differently. And if it turns out that long before any Chinese expansion, people with European genes lived here, wearing checkered woolen coats and grazing cattle along dry rivers, this calls into question the entire narrative about the historical identity of the region. For decades, this question languished in academic obscurity. In 2021, the journal Nature published a study that had been awaited by several generations of scientists. An international team of geneticists finally gained access to DNA samples from 13 mummies from the Tarim basin. The results were both unambiguous and completely baffling. The mummies were neither Proto-Indo-Europeans, nor the ancestors of modern Uyghurs, nor migrants from the Middle East. They represented an isolated population, genetically related to the so-called steppe lineage, which goes back to the hunter-gatherers of northern Eurasia during the Pleistocene era. Simply put, their ancestors lived for millennia separately from the rest of humanity. No interbreeding, no influx of genes from outside. A closed genetic island in the middle of the continent. Where they came from is unknown. How they ended up in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth is unknown. And where they disappeared to is also unknown. Approximately 1,500 years after the first burials appeared, traces of this population ceased. Not gradually, not through assimilation, they simply disappeared. No transitional burials, no traces of interbreeding with neighboring peoples, no evidence of migration. They were there, and then they were gone. The Lulan beauty is now kept in the Urumqi Museum behind glass in a climate-controlled display case. Access for foreign researchers remains restricted. Some of the mummies have not yet undergone full genetic identification. Uyghur activists claim them as their ancestors. Chinese official sources avoid this topic. Western anthropologists formulate their conclusions cautiously, trying not to create political pretexts. And in the storerooms of the Urumqi Museum, according to several researchers who worked there in the 1990s, there are mummies that have never been officially catalogued. No one has photographed them. No one has described them in open publications. What they depict is unknown. 4,000 years ago, in the very heart of Asia, there lived people who shouldn't have been there. They left behind bodies, fabrics, and grain. They left behind faces that could be painted. And they vanished as if they had never existed. There is only one question. Someone really doesn't want us to know why. In March 1974, 21-year-old Terry Betts found a metal ball on his property. He picked it up, examined it from all sides, and took it home. 3 months later, the United States Navy officially confiscated the find. A few weeks later, the sphere vanished without a trace, and no one has been able to say where it is since. The Betts family lived on Fort George Island in northeastern Florida, about 20 kilometers from Jacksonville. It's a quiet place. Low pine trees, marshy banks, roads that end at the water. The family's father, Antoine Betts, was involved in land and real estate management. The mother, Jessie, ran the household. Terry, the eldest child, a student with a slight interest in music, spent every weekend on the family property. An ordinary Florida family, an ordinary life. In early March of 1974, a fire broke out on their 88-acre property. It burned the forest down to the charred ground. This in itself would not be strange if not for one circumstance. In those days, there were no thunderstorms or extreme heat over the island. Meteorological data for that period did not record a single lightning strike within a 20-kilometer radius. The cause of the fire remains officially unknown. On March 21st, the family went out to inspect the burnt-out area. Charred tree trunks, gray ash, the smell of burnt resin. Terry was walking along the edge of the fire when he saw it. Among the ashes, in a small hollow between the roots, a metal ball, about 20 centimeters in diameter, perfectly round, perfectly smooth. No seams, no holes, no signs of fastening. The surface is like polished stainless steel, but with a subtle silver sheen. It was heavy, about the same weight as a hard metal ball of that size. Terry picked it up with both hands and showed it to his parents. They decided to take it with them. For the first few days, nothing happened. Then the family noticed their poodle was acting strange. As soon as the ball was brought into the room where the dog was, the animal began to whine, pressed itself against the wall, and covered its face with its paws. It didn't bark. It didn't growl. It was whining, quietly, monotonously, as if it were hearing something inaudible to the human ear. Around that time, the first of what Terry later called ball behavior occurred. Someone in the family bumped into it, and the ball rolled across the wooden living room floor. After a few seconds, it slowed down and stopped. This would have been normal if not for what happened next. The ball slowly turned exactly 90 degrees and rolled back exactly to the place from which it had started. Then again, and again. The family watched the ball move across the floor on its own for nearly 12 minutes straight, turning precisely at a right angle each time. No tilt of the floor, no air current. Jessie Betts later told reporters, "We just watched without moving. We just didn't understand what we were seeing." When Terry picked up the guitar and began to play, the ball vibrated. It didn't fall. It didn't budge. It vibrated, resonating in time with the strings. It responded to certain tonalities, and this could be reproduced over and over again. On sunny days, as soon as the ball was brought into direct light, the surface began to tremble slightly, like the body of a running engine, although no sound was heard. In April 1974, the story hit the press. First, local Jacksonville publications, then national ones. After the first publications, something began to happen in the Betts house, which the family described in the same way. Slamming doors in closed rooms, sounds similar to an organ or harpsichord, quiet, melodic, coming from nowhere. This went on for several weeks. Scientists who came to examine the sphere couldn't agree even on its basic characteristics. X-rays showed an incomprehensible structure inside, either nested spheres or internal partitions, but interpretations differed. The metal could not be accurately identified by standard methods, although it resembled stainless steel in a number of parameters. Dr. Carl Hurst of the University of Florida, who studied the ball in May of that year, publicly stated that he could not explain the mechanics of its motion. It was a rarity, a scientist saying, "I don't know," in front of cameras. In the summer of 1974, the military intervened. U.S. Navy officials arrived on Fort George Island and officially seized the balloon for national security research. The family was given a receipt. Several weeks later, the ball was returned, along with a brief report that stated only that the object posed no threat and was not a military item of known origin. No further explanation. No conclusions about the nature of the orb. The report was less than a page long. Then, the orb disappeared. The Betts family couldn't explain exactly when this happened. One day, he simply wasn't there. No one had forced the doors. There were no signs of forced entry. Antoine Betts contacted the local police. The case was recorded, but the investigation yielded no results. Neither the ball itself nor information about who might have taken it and when was ever established. Several years passed. Journalists periodically returned to the story, in 1977, in 1983. Terry Betts became increasingly withdrawn. In an interview in 1986, he said only one thing: "I wish we'd left him where we found him." The U.S. Navy has never officially commented on the contents of its study. The full text of the report, if it exists, has not been made publicly available. The land on Fort George Island changed hands several times. The spot where the sphere was found remains unmarked today. What was it? An industrial product of unknown origin? A probe? Something that fell from the sky during the forest fire and started the blaze? Or something that had been in the ground for much longer than we could imagine? The ball was found among the ashes. They took it home. They studied it. They confiscated it. They returned it. And then it disappeared. Who do you think really took it last? In the summer of 1908, an Italian archaeologist unearthed from Cretan soil an object that shouldn't have existed, not because it was too old, and not because it was too complex, because it was one and only, the only one in the entire world. In 118 years of searching, not a second one, not a fragment, not even a hint of a similar one was found. The language in which the Phaistos disc is written is found nowhere else on the planet. And this is perhaps the most disturbing thing known about it. Luigi Pernier was a methodical man, a 40-year-old Florentine with an academic bearing and a habit of writing everything down in a leather notebook. He had already spent several seasons on Crete, methodically uncovering the layers of Minoan civilization. Excavations of the palace of Phaistos, one of the largest Minoan centers in the south of the island, proceeded systematically, almost boringly. Pernier arrived at the excavation site around 8 in the morning, drank coffee from a tin mug, and assigned tasks to the workers. An ordinary man doing an ordinary job. Nothing in his biography foreshadowed what would happen on July 14, 1908. It was cloudy that morning. Workers were opening a basement in the northeastern wing of the palace, the so-called storage room, located at a depth of approximately 2.5 meters below the surface. The earth was dense and scorched, the result of an ancient fire that destroyed the palace around the 17th century BC. It was this fire, as scientists would later determine, that scorched the disk, inadvertently preserving it for 3,500 years. Pernier described the moment of discovery sparingly, almost perfunctorily. The workers stumbled upon an object with his shovel. Pernier approached, bent down, and picked it up. A clay disc about 16 centimeters in diameter. Both sides are covered in symbols spiraling from the edge to the center. 241 symbols, 45 unique characters, and most importantly, they are not drawn or cut by hand. They are stamped. Each symbol is a separate seal, applied to the wet clay with a clarity and repeatability not expected from the 17th century BC. This is the first paradox, which researchers prefer not to formulate out loud too loudly. The Phaistos disc is the oldest known example of printed text. The typographic principle, one stamp, multiple uses, appeared here 3,000 years before Gutenberg. But if someone went to the trouble of creating a set of 45 separate stamp symbols, then those symbols were used often enough to justify the effort. So there was an entire writing system, an entire tradition, an entire culture that wrote in this language. So where are all the other texts? In over 100 years of excavations on Crete and throughout the Mediterranean, not a single other artifact with these signs has been found. Not a tablet, not a potsherd, not a scratched inscription on a wall. Absolutely zero. The language of the Phaistos disc exists in a single copy, as if someone wrote one page in a non-existent language and then destroyed everything else. The academic community explains this simply. They haven't found it. They'll find it. But this explanation becomes less and less convincing with each passing decade. Linear A, another undeciphered Minoan system, is found on hundreds of objects across the island. Linear B is found on thousands. Hieroglyphic Minoan writing is found on dozens of seals and tablets. But the symbols of the Phaistos disc are nowhere to be found except the disc itself. It's as if it fell from another world and accidentally landed here. Attempts to decipher the code began almost immediately and continue to this day. Over 200 variants have been developed over 118 years. Researchers read the disc as a prayer, as an astronomical calendar, as a military hymn, as a list of names, as navigation instructions, as a recording of a musical piece. Frequency analysis, comparative linguistics, and computer algorithms were used. None of the results were accepted. None were reproduced by independent researchers. In 1999, the Greek linguist Garis Florakis published an analysis of the disc as a text in an early Greek dialect. In 2014, Oxford researcher Gareth Owens claimed to have read several words, presumably religious invocations to the goddess. In 2023, a group of researchers from Bologna applied machine learning methods to the analysis of the structure of characters. The academic community has carefully read each of these works and carefully set them aside. There is, however, a detail that is mentioned less often in popular reviews than it should be. In the same layer where the disc was found, there was a tablet with Linear A, a completely different writing system used in Crete during the same historical period. This means that whoever kept the disc was familiar with other writing systems. They weren't isolated. They could compare. And yet, the disc is written differently. Fundamentally, irreducibly differently. Several researchers over the years have put forward a theory that is not favored by the academic community. The disc may be an imported item, brought from a territory where this writing system existed fully, but which has either not yet been found or has been destroyed so completely that it left no traces. The chemical composition of the clay supports this theory. Some analyses indicate that it differs from the Cretan samples. Other analyses do not confirm this. The question remains open. The disc itself is now kept in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in a separate display case behind glass. Tourists take thousands of photographs of it every day. Small, brown, unremarkable, unless you know you're looking at it. The museum plaque nearby reads, Phaistos disc, circa 18th to 17th century BC. Purpose and language unknown. 3,500 years old. 200 attempts to read. Not a single second copy. Someone wrote something very important a long time ago, or prepared very carefully to write a lot, creating a complete set of characters. And either never wrote anything else, or the writing disappeared so completely that it left no trace. Neither explanation makes the story any less plausible. What was recorded on this disc? And why did this particular text outlive everything else? In 1961, 50-year-old Romanian archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa lifted 3 palm-sized clay fragments from the ground. Radiocarbon dating showed an age of 5,300 BC. This meant one thing. Someone was writing 1,000 years before the Sumerians. Official science chose to ignore it. Nicolae Vlasa worked at the Institute of History and Archaeology at the University of Cluj. A short, neat man, he had a habit of wearing the same canvas jacket on excavations and a tweed jacket in the classroom. Colleagues described him as a man who was methodical to the point of pedantry. He kept field notes in school notebooks with cardboard covers, numbered the pages by hand, and dated each entry down to the hour. He lived alone, without family. His habits included early rising, strong coffee, and long walks along the Mureș River. The summer of 1961 was dry. The settlement of Tartaria in Transylvania, in the county of Alba, was known as a monument of the Vinca culture, a Neolithic civilization that occupied the territory from modern Hungary to the Black Sea coast for almost 2,000 years. Vlasa was digging here for the second season. The work was routine. Potsherds, animal bones, traces of fireplaces. On the morning of July 28th, his shovel uncovered a layer of burnt earth at a depth of about 80 centimeters. Beneath it was a small pit, a ritual one he immediately determined from the nature of the burial. Inside, an idol figurine, a bracelet made of spondylus shells, and human bones. Calcified, that is, burned, and 3 tablets, small, almost childish. 2 rectangular, approximately 6 by 3 centimeters in size. One is round with a hole in the center, like an amulet. Each one was embossed with symbols, grooves, cross-shaped figures, animals, vertical lines. Vlasa packed the finds in newspaper and took them to Cluj. When the radiocarbon dating results came in, he stared at the numbers for a long time. 5,300 years BC. Sumerian writing, the world's first, according to generally accepted chronology, emerged around 4,000 years BC. The gap was more than 1,000 years. Vlasa published his results in 1963 in a Romanian archaeological journal. The reaction from the global scientific community was muted. Too muted. Some researchers have suggested that the signs on the tablets are not writing in the strict sense, but trademarks or ritual symbols. The argument sounded convincing. Signs cannot be considered writing if their meaning is unknown. But it was precisely this argument that raised questions among those who studied the tablets carefully. Because the Tartarian symbols visually matched a number of early Sumerian pictograms, not similar but identical in shape. A cross in a circle, a branching symbol, a line with a serif. Coincidence? Possibly. But Pakistani professor Mohammad Safi Farooq Hudud Ayan thought differently. In the 1970s, he conducted a comparative analysis of the Tartarian signs and the early Sumerian tablets from Uruk. His conclusion: if the dating is correct, then the Vinca culture stands at the origins of the written tradition that later emerged in Mesopotamia. Not a parallel development, but a source. Official science has not responded to this thesis, neither with refutation nor confirmation, simply with silence. In 1983, Nikolai Vlasa died in Cluj. He was 72 years old. After his death, it was discovered that part of his field notes, notebooks containing detailed documentation of the 1961 excavations, had disappeared. They had not been archived. It wasn't handed over to colleagues. It simply ceased to exist. The Institute reported that the documents were not found among personal belongings. 3 original tablets are now kept in the National History Museum of Romania in Bucharest. For several decades, independent researchers who requested access for radiocarbon dating using modern methods were refused or met with prolonged silence. The reasons were never explained. There's another detail that's rarely mentioned. The Vinca culture, the same one that created the Tartaria tablets, disappeared completely around 3,500 BC. It didn't dissolve gradually. It wasn't assimilated. It simply ceased to exist. Settlements abandoned, traditions interrupted. The reason remains unknown. The civilization that may have invented writing disappeared without a trace, and 3 clay fragments with her signs lay for 7,000 years in a ritual pit next to burnt bones, as if someone deliberately buried something that should not have existed. We don't know what's written on the Tartaria tablets. Why Vlasa's notes disappeared is unknown. Why access to the originals remained closed is unexplained. And why did the civilization that left these marks suddenly cease to exist? Do you really think these are just trademarks? In 2017, a small article in the medical journal The Lancet slipped by unnoticed and sank to the bottom. No press conferences, no excitement, just a few pages with x-rays and dry anthropometric data. Meanwhile, the subject was a man who lived 3,000 years ago and didn't fit into any known category. His skeleton lay in storage for over 100 years. David Randall McIver raised it from the ground back in 1901 in a rock mastaba near Abu Roash, northwest of Giza. The tomb was modest. No wall inscriptions, no funerary texts, just a body. Just bones. Randall McIver cataloged the find, packed it, and passed it on. The identity of the remains remained controversial for a long time. A team led by paleoanthropologist Michael Pagan returned to the skeleton 116 years later. Dating revealed the Third Dynasty, circa 2700 BC. ACT scan revealed the man's height during his lifetime, 196 centimeters. Given the average height of an Egyptian man at that time, 160 to 165 centimeters, this was an anomaly outside the normal distribution. He was not just a tall man. Clinical gigantism is the first reliably confirmed case in the entire history of ancient Egypt. Pagan formulated the problem cautiously. Most likely, it was a pituitary gland disorder, an overproduction of growth hormone. The man was sick. Such people, as a rule, don't live to old age. Their joints collapse under their own weight. Their hearts work beyond repair. This one, apparently, was no exception. The growth itself is a medical anomaly. But what happened next goes beyond medicine. As early as the 1880s, American newspapers began publishing reports of expeditions to the burial mounds of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Correspondents described skeletons as tall as 2.5, 3, and even 4 meters. Local newspapers, Smithsonian reports, and Bureau of American Ethnology records, all of this circulated for decades. The Smithsonian Institution always responded the same way. Either the artifact was not deposited, or the data is not confirmed, or simply remained silent. Reporters and history buffs trying to access the archives were met with standard language about lost specimens. In 2014, the satirical portal World News Daily Report published an article, "The Smithsonian Institute destroyed millions of skeletons of giants." The post was marked as fiction, in small print at the very bottom of the page. This didn't stop it from being shared in tens of millions of ways. By 2017, the Smithsonian conspiracy story was circulating online as documented fact, with quotes supposedly from former employees, with references to non-existent court rulings, with photographs that turned out to be art installations and Photoshop. And then, in this very year, a real scientific article comes out in The Lancet, with names, with methodology, with tomograms, with peer review. Almost no one noticed it. It's worth wondering, why? An audience that has consumed material about giant skeletons for years has literally ignored the only real case. Perhaps the answer is simple. A real giant is disappointing. He doesn't fit the narrative of a vanished race or of antediluvian people the size of a 3-story building. He was sick. He suffered. He died young, in a country where even tall people rarely exceeded 6 feet tall. He was buried in an unmarked, unadorned tomb. The supposed identification with Pharaoh Sa-Nakht, the first or second ruler of the Third Dynasty, remains controversial. Pagan and his co-authors admit this possibility, but they caution that the evidence is insufficient. The name carved on the stele near Abu Roash belongs specifically to Sa-Nakht. Whether the mastaba was his tomb is an open question. What's not clear is the chain of events between 1901 and 2017. Where were the bones stored in the interim? Who had access to them? Why did it take over a century to identify them? Science has answers to all these questions, albeit undramatic ones. Bureaucracy, colonial confusion in the distribution of finds, underfunding of anthropological research. The skeleton simply lay there. No one hid it. No one deliberately kept it silent. This is perhaps the strangest thing. The storage facilities of academic institutions are full of such unopened boxes, while the internet is convinced that the giants were destroyed by order from above. In 1901, a man dug something out of the earth that defied conventional wisdom. In 2017, another man finally took a closer look. Between these two moments, there are 116 years of silence. The question is, what exactly was silent? Science, or we ourselves preferring conspiracy theories to the quiet fact from a medical journal?